Yeah, I get to introduce you, Marianne, so give me a second. Our next speaker is Marianne Stam. She's currently the acting supervisor for the Trace Evidence Firearms and Crime Scene Unit at the California Department of Justice Criminalistics Laboratory in Riverside. She's worked for that agency for 23 years and has worked in the Trace Evidence section for 21 of those years. She's a member of the SWGMAC committee since 1996. I beat you by 2 years on that. And she serves on the paint subgroup committee. And one thing you probably don't know about Marianne is she raises chickens. Marianne's going to be speaking on the value of diatoms and botanical evidence in a police brutality case and a technique for the collection and examination of diatom evidence.
Thank you, Glenn. I just want to say that the chickens are pets, not lunch. Okay. Today I'm going to speak to you about a case in which I had to know something about the case in order to be able to corroborate this person's story. And so just going back to what Tom was saying, you can't operate in a vacuum. This case involved a man who was walking home in the early morning hours of July 5th, 1997. When he was walking through downtown Riverside when he was stopped by 3 Riverside Police Department officers for allegedly being intoxicated. The officers, according to the man's story, instead of taking him to the jail, they drove him about a mile in the opposite direction to a park area called Fairmont Park that happened to have a lake in it, and the lake is called Lake Evans, and it's in Riverside. The man claimed that they dragged him out of their unit. They dragged him through some a short sandy area along the edge of the lake, and they threw him in the lake. Now, this is Lake Evans. It's a man-made lake that was basically made in the early 1900s. And that's where all of the plants were brought in and planted around the lake to make the park. And the lake along this edge right here, there's a road that actually goes around the lake. And back in that area is where the man claimed that the officers drove him, dragged him out of the vehicle, beat him up, and threw him in the lake. So this is a picture of the area, and the road is right here. This is the shoreline area, and the lake's over here, and this is an area over here also. I just am showing this because I collected samples, and I collected samples from across the street as well. Now, this shows kind of just nice pictures showing the different varieties of plants, how pretty it can be, and that it's basically all brought in plant material or trees. I was called up by the Riverside Police Department a few days after this happened, and they had gone to the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory and inquired about having an analysis done. But due to the cost of having the analysis done, which would have been water chemistry, they decided to call the lab and see if they could get something done for cheap, which was basically free. So they asked me, was there anything that we could do to show that this man may actually be telling the truth? So they wanted me to look for something that showed that he had been in or around the park and the lake. So my first thought to the officers was, well, I'll look for diatoms and I'll look for plant material. So, and they happened to have the clothing of the victim, but unfortunately they did not have the clothing from the police officers because they didn't actually start questioning the police officers for a couple of weeks after this incident. The man did go to the police fairly quickly. He went, I believe, like the next day, several hours after the incident. So the officers in the 2-week period had basically cleaned all of their their uniforms, had them dry cleaned. And so I didn't, get their clothing to work with. But anyway, before I get into my analysis, I just wanted to divert a little bit into diatoms and what they are. They're basically a single-celled algae that have silicified cell walls. And many of the fossil type diatoms that we find and the parts that are left behind from diatoms that die are basically these silica-based cell walls. There are, as of latest information, close to 100,000 species. And the interesting thing is that some live as floaters, also known as pelagic, in open water, and others at the water-sediment interface, where they are ground dwellers or benthic. These are some pictures of diatoms that I got off the internet. And if you notice, some are more round and some are elongated. And according to a diatom expert that I spoke to, the shape can be an indicator of whether you're dealing with a pelagic species or a water-sediment interface species. And by the way, I got back from China about 3 weeks ago, and we went to a national park, and there were actually living diatom algae that I got to see, which I probably would not have ever recognized, except there was a professor along who knew about diatoms. So it was kind of neat to see that. But anyway, back to the examples of the diatoms as evidence. They have been encountered for years in drowning cases where pathologists look for them in the lungs of victims. I've encountered them, and they've also been encountered for years forensically as fillers in matches and paint. They are in soils where you have moisture, and they also have been used by environmental forensic work as indicators of the environment, of water-rich environments and environmental conditions and changes in environmental conditions. They've also been used as safe insulations. My case approach was I got the clothing in from the victim, and I examined the clothing for the evidence, indicating A, that the clothing had been wet, because then that would be one of the indicators that he may be telling the truth, that he was in the water at least. Then I looked for plant material, and then the diatoms, because diatoms will be indicators of a water-rich environment, often standing bodies of water. So anyway, so this is basically what I've already said, that the investigators submitted the clothing. They wanted to corroborate the victim's story, and that the officer's clothing were not submitted because of the duration of time between the incident and the questioning of the officers. So evidence collected in the laboratory, I collected the plant material, I collected loose debris from the bags that the clothing came in. And from the victim's clothing, my first act for collecting trace was to use tape lifts. The tape I used is a frosted form of Scotch tape. We use that because it isn't as tacky and sticky as, say, fingerprint tape or clear tape. And so it's easier to get trace evidence off of it. So that's why we use that. After I took the tape lifts, I did debris collection by scraping and shaking the clothing. And then I also did cuttings of the stained areas and of clean control areas from the victim's clothing. I also went to Lake Evans with a botanist and the investigators, and I collected the following samples. I collected lake water that was close to the shore near the site of the incident, lake water from the middle of the lake, sand samples from the shoreline near the site, and sand samples west and across the street from the site. And I also collected botanical exemplars with, of course, the aid of the botanist. The evidence analysis. My first thing was I examined the evidence that I had collected using visual and stereo microscopy, polarizing light microscopy, and then the botanical evidence that was collected off of the victim's clothes, I submitted to the botanist, and he was the one that analyzed the botanical evidence. Well, I was trying to figure out how would I find diatoms on clothing. And so I first tried looking at the scraped, shaken debris from the victim's clothes for the diatoms by mounting portions of the debris that I had sieved in ultra-purified water and examining them under polarizing light microscopy. I also looked at blanks of the ultra-purified water to ensure that I wasn't contaminating my sample before I even used the water. And I found no diatoms in it, nothing, in fact, that I could see. And I tried this analysis for about 2 to 3 days, just looking through this stuff. And I didn't find anything that I could really see that looked like what I, had seen diatoms what diatoms look like. So then I thought, well, I'll take the tape lifts, but then how am I going to look at them? How am I even going to find the diatoms on the tape lifts to examine? So I decided to try something. So I took the tape lifts, I cut them into smaller pieces, and I took the taped ends, I rolled them over the very end pieces, stuck those down so that the sticky side was up on the slide, and then I mounted, I put ultra-purified water on a small portion of the tape just to see if it would work of one of these lifts. And I put a cover slip on top, and I looked at it under PLM, and within 5 minutes, I started finding diatoms. So at least what this did was it allowed me to visualize the diatoms. And that was I was really glad that that worked. And basically, I was interested in finding the presence of diatoms to show that the victim was in or near a standing body of water. As I said, I went to a botanist, gave him the botanical evidence from the University of California, Riverside Botanical Gardens herbarium. He was actually the curator of that herbarium and gardens. And then I contacted a diatom expert at the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco and sent him the diatoms and the information to see what he could come up with. And of course, I also looked at the exemplars that I had collected from around the lake of the diatoms. And my findings, well, there were diffuse brown stains on the victim's boots and jeans indicating that they had been wet. There were several diatoms on the tape lifts of the victim's clothing that, to me, were similar in appearance to the diatoms observed in the lake water and in the sand samples surrounding the lake. And then that was confirmed by the diatomist. And then the botanist found leaves and cone scales on the victim's clothing that were from a Mexican bald cypress tree. Well, Mexican bald cypress trees, as I found out, were sort of the national tree of Mexico. And as it turns out, these trees were imported into Riverside in the early 1900s, specifically to be planted around Lake Evans. The botanist knew of only one other of these types of trees in all of Riverside, and that happened to be at the Botanical Gardens about 10 miles away. So finding these cone scales and plant material from the Mexican bald cypress was the most significant piece of evidence in this case. That combined with the diatoms from the clothing, which there's a picture here of one. Unfortunately, it's not a very good picture because it was taken under a Polaroid before we had digital cameras, and I probably should have taken 35 millimeter, apologize for that. And then here's a diatom from the lake that was identified by the diatomist. And so my conclusions are that the diatoms and botanical evidence and the presence of the diffuse stains showing that the victim's clothing had been wet provided strong evidence that the victim had been in Lake Evans or its immediate vicinity when you combined all the evidence together. The method that I used worked as a search method. I'm sure other people have probably used similar methods, but it actually, with the tape lift idea, it helps to preserve positional information if that ever becomes important in an investigation. In this case, it wasn't, but I figured in other cases you might, be able to use that. My mounting method, just a real simple diagram. I have the slide here. Here's my piece of tape. I took the ends and rolled them under so that the sticky ends were stuck to the slide. I put the, here's say one of the areas I'm looking at on the tape lift. I just put a little bit of the ultra pure water on and put a cover slip on, put it under the PLM and examined it and found the diatoms. Consequences, all 3 police officers were fired and all pled guilty to assault charges. And I'd like to thank UC Riverside Herbarium curator Andy Sanders and the diatom expert from the California Academy of Sciences, Pat Kosiolek. And I also want to point out how important it really was to keep contacts with academic communities, because I've used Andy in a number of cases, and I haven't had the pleasure to use Pat in another diatom case yet. And that's it.
Does anybody have questions for Mary Ann?
Oh, thank you.
I think she does have an announcement to make or something else to say.
Oh, I do. Some of you may have seen the announcement for the International Soil Forensics Conference that will be next year in Long Beach, California in early November 2010. I'd like to encourage all of you to contact me if you want information regarding that meeting. It is affiliated with the international joint meeting of the Soil Science Society of America, I believe it's called the American Agronomical Society, and the Crop Science Society of America. It is its own separate part of that conference, and it's kind of like a mini conference in the larger conference. So if anybody's interested, just let me know. It's on soil forensics, and it is an international meeting.
Guy, do you have a question?
Guy Nutter from the Michigan State Police. Just out of curiosity, the conclusion in your report, had you not had the botanical evidence, what type of a statement would have you said about that evidence without that?
Well, I would have probably left it more up to the diatom expert to write a report and send it to the investigators. I probably would have said I found diatoms and the fact that there were diffuse wet stains on the clothing, and I probably most likely would have looked more and sent more botanical evidence over to an expert in water botanical plants, because there was a lot more of that kind of plant material as well. So I would have backed off some, although I would have probably stated that the diatoms indicate he was in or close to a moist, standing body of water or a moist environment. So.
Hi, I'm Doreen Hudson from the Los Angeles Police Department, and I might have missed this, but I'm not really clear on how placing this victim at the location of the lake was incriminating to the officers. Was there something contextual in their version of events that proved them to be untruthful? I missed a little link there.
Yes, the police officers made statements that they had not been around the lake. They said they stopped the individual but let him go, and that was about a mile away from where the lake was. In addition, the investigators were questioning this guy because they didn't know if the internal affairs investigators, because they didn't know if he was actually intoxicated or not. And so they wanted some independent evidence to corroborate his story as well, because they didn't know whether to trust his story or not. So.